Hello, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today for an amazing session on patient-centric clinical trial innovations amidst COVID-19. We have an amazing panel today that has come together from all over the world just to give you the insights on how we're trying to accelerate clinical research to provide the fastest options for treatment for COVID-19 and for the cancer patients and patient community at large. So just to give you an introduction for some of the panelists, we have Craig Lipset, who was the head of innovation at Pfizer. We have Kent Dolke, who's the EVP and Chief Scientific Officer from PRA Health Sciences. We have Dr. Kapil Kamboja, who is logged in from India, and he's the VP of Medical Writing at GenPro Research. We have Alicia Staley, who's a Hodgkin's lymphoma survivor and Director of Patient Engagement at Medidata Solutions. And then Alyssa Gentile, the Clinical Trial Director from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Now, just a couple of disclaimers. Some of these individuals will be providing their own opinions and not representing their institutions. If you have specific questions regarding your cancer care, those are best directed towards your oncologists and your clinical care team because they know the most about your condition. But as we go through this panel together and we get into some issues and topics, feel free to chime in and ask your questions and we'll do our best to address them. So just to get started with an introduction, my name is Arun Sivanandan. I'm a clinical trial specialist at the Stanford Cancer Institute, where I do investigator-initiated trials and industry-sponsored trials at different phases of clinical development. I started wanting to become a doctor and I went through medical school, but near the end, unfortunately, my dad got a glioblastoma, which is one of the worst forms of brain cancer. We did everything we could for him. We even enrolled him in a clinical trial, but he passed 1 year after diagnosis. That really changed my outlook, and I wanted to devote the rest of my time towards clinical research to find the best cures for patients. And that's why I switched to doing clinical trials, and I love clinical trials. Now, I want to start introducing some of our panelists here, and while they go ahead and get introduced, please do chime in. Let us know where you're logging in from and how the weather is out there. So let's start with some panelists, and as we go through a round robin here, please introduce yourself. Say what you're doing and what you're interested in and what you hope the audience will get out of this session. Let's start with you, Craig.
Thank you so much, Arun, to you and the organizers. It's really an honor to be here with these panelists and with all of you in the audience who are participating today. My name is Craig Lipset. I'm joining you here today from sunny New Jersey. My background that brought me here is the convergence of three things in my life. I have worked in the pharmaceutical industry for several decades, most recently as head of innovation for medicine development at Pfizer. I'm also trained in epidemiology and infectious disease, but I also, like many in this audience, live the life of a patient, in my case with pulmonary sarcoidosis, so managing an immune-mediated pulmonary condition during this pandemic. You know, most of my work right now has been working with different pharmaceutical biotech technology companies around ways to make clinical trials run better and smarter across different disease areas. But like many on this call, over the last few weeks, it's been all about COVID-19 and how do we keep existing clinical trials running so that patients who are depending upon those investigational medicines right now can continue to have access, and so that we can minimize the delay over the next few months or years of slowed new medicines reaching patients who are waiting as they get approved.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Craig. Can we switch over to you, Kent?
Sure, good afternoon. I'm Kent Dolke. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President for Scientific and Medical Affairs at PRA Health Sciences. In my day job, I oversee science and medicine and safety for patients, but I also oversee our entire digital health strategy. Not unlike you, Arun, a number of years ago, my father passed away from glioblastoma. And one of the things that, as you experience as a caregiver, is the extreme burden for patients to actually get care. So the sheer number of site visits, procedures, et cetera, that these cancer patients and all patients really have to undergo just to be able to access clinical research or clinical studies, those barriers are just simply too high. And so we really focus, and my focus in particular has been, how do we leverage technology, mobile access, remote patient monitoring to really lower that burden and replace a lot of those in-clinic visits with home monitoring and home access. So, you know, every day we just think about how do we make it easier for patients to participate, and then COVID-19 came along. And all of a sudden we had thousands and thousands of patients in participation in clinical trials who couldn't access their clinics. And so very quickly we were able to kind of turn on a dime and use a lot of that technology to help keep the data integrity going for those trials, but more importantly, make sure that those patients that needed it, that were immune compromised, could still get care from home without being put at greater risk by going to a clinic or a hospital. And equally, by doing that, making sure the hospital had the bandwidth to treat those patients they needed to do. So there's lots of opportunity here, but at the end of the day, you know, all we think about is how do we make patient access easier for everyone.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Kent. Alyssa, I'd like to turn it over to you, please.
Yeah, my name's Alyssa Gentile. I am coming from you right outside of Boston in Newton, Massachusetts, and it was snowed here this morning. But I am the director of the Clinical Trial Support Center at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. I lead a team of nurse navigators, and we work with patients, their caregivers, and treatment teams one-on-one to provide them assistance in regards to clinical trials and treatment options. So the nurses and nurse navigators will help them navigate the clinical trial landscape. And obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, this landscape got even more complicated than what it was beforehand. So over the past couple of months, we've been essentially really needed for these patients to ensure that we can give them the most accurate and up-to-date information about clinical trials, whether they're looking to enroll into a clinical trial, or particularly those that are enrolled, and what does that mean for them moving forward being in their clinical trial.
That's amazing, Alyssa. Thank you so much for that introduction. Dr. Kambolja, we'll turn it over to you. How late is it over there in India? And please do introduce yourself. Thank you.
Sure, Arun. Thanks. Hi, everyone. So this is Kapil Kambolja. I'm Vice President at GenPro Research for Medical Writing and Real World Evidence. And I'm joining from Baroda, Gujarat in India. So this is the state from where our Prime Minister Narendra Modi is coming from. And it's almost half past midnight here, but I'm really excited to be part of this panel. And myself, I'm a pharmaceutical scientist by education, and have worked in preclinical research as well as clinical research with various pharma companies. And while working with global pharma companies as well as with CRO in past, I realized that there are lots of processes which were done in conventional way, and there is a lot of scope that we can employ technology or even the process innovation that can help to speed up the things. And that's exactly what we are doing at GenPro Research, while we are working with partners to enhance the speed and accuracy of clinical development. And in particular for COVID-19, it put us in a very critical situation. Actually, we had a plan to integrate our 4th office in the month of March. And then exactly at that time, like, I relocated with my family to Baroda, and within 3 days, this national lockdown was announced. So that impacted not only me, my family, but lot of my team members who relocated. But within few days, we changed our strategy, and now all of us are mostly working remotely. And besides our regular work, we are doing and stretching a lot to help our partners to work in COVID-19 research. And that's what we are doing and collaborating very closely. And I'm also contributing to AAPM's ACT Taskforce, so that we can do a good brainstorm and help to the partners. So thanks again, everyone, and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, wonderful, Dr. Kambolja. Thank you so much for giving your time and staying up late at night to do this. It's an all hands on deck approach. Alicia, we'll turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Alicia Staley. I am the Senior Director for Patient Engagement at Metadata Solutions. I am also a 3-time cancer survivor. I've actually had Hodgkin's lymphoma and breast cancer twice. So I feel like I've won the cancer lottery 3 times. My career has really been in engineering and information systems, but in the last 10 years, I've moved into life sciences, first as a consultant, trying to help improve the patient experience for patients going through the cancer journey, but also really trying to focus on helping cancer patients find and participate in clinical trials in particular. All 3 times I was diagnosed with cancer, I was presented with a clinical trial, which is very unusual for somebody. When I first was diagnosed, I was 19 years old. And at that point, clinical trials were not really at the forefront of a treatment option for a patient. But I learned very early on that access to cancer care is, while I was able to get all the care that I needed, it's unusual. There's still a lot of access issues, not only for just basic cancer care, but when it comes to clinical trials, it's even more of a challenge. And, you know, with what we're seeing right now with the COVID-19 and the coronavirus epidemic, we're seeing access to clinical trials really be halted to deal with this pandemic. So this is a very timely panel, and I'm looking forward to participating. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Alicia. That was great. And just to add to some of the points made by the panelists, I'm also part of the American Association for Precision Medicine's Coronavirus Task Force, codenamed ACT. And it was created really as a response to this pandemic to get an all hands on deck approach. I just want to give a quick shout out to everybody who's encouraged me in the past couple of months, couple of years. First of all, I'd like to start with some of my mentors, including Dr. Prashun Mishra, who is the CEO and founder of the American Association for Precision Medicine, Dr. Kamala Madali. And then at the Stanford Cancer Institute, I have multiple mentors, Dr. George Fisher, Dr. Pamela Coons, Dr. Electron Kabebu. And then my colleagues are my work family at Stanford, and you know who you are. And then a big shout out to my friends from Detroit, the Detroit boys. You know who you are as well. So with that, let's get started on some questions. Now, just a general question to all of you. When we talk about precision medicine, multiple lines of therapy investigated for cancer patients is a precise approach and sometimes the only treatment option for these patients. An infographic that I recently saw shows the current state of cancer clinical trials amidst COVID-19. And I'm going to try to share my screen here to get to that infographic. And can I get some input from some of the panelists about what this means?
You know, Arun, in some ways, the distribution is not surprising. In some ways, it mirrors a lot of the medicine development and clinical trials portfolios that are out there today. Many companies have more studies happening in oncology as well as in many rare disorders as a category than most other therapeutic areas. I think there are a number of countermeasures that different study sponsors and investigators have been trying to stand up during this pandemic. Sometimes some of those countermeasures are a little easier for small molecules, pills, as compared to the strategies people can stand up for injectables or infused therapies, and those may lean heavier into oncology. But I guess the other observation I would share on this slide, Arun, is that the ability for research sponsors to pivot trials into the home, it's not new. It's been something that, you know, many on this call have been working on for years. But in many organizations, they may have shied away from introducing that and learning about it in oncology. They were afraid to. They might have looked at dermatology or other indications as being a little lower risk and an easier place to try to shift participation into the home. But it's the cancer patients, more than most anyone else, who truly deserves that opportunity to stay home and be spared the travel, especially in this environment. And so that may be a few thoughts on why we're seeing the distribution as it looked on that graph.
No, that's great, Craig. And so I think what I understood from that is that some of these cancer trials are a little more complex, depending on what type of trial they may be. They may involve infusion therapies that are chemotherapy based. And there's some of the newer technology now that's, the CAR T therapies as well. Alicia and Alyssa, do you kind of agree with that the cancer trials might be a little more complex, which might be why they're more impacted compared to trials in general?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we are seeing a lot of CAR T trials be put on hold, and for many different reasons. Some of the reason is because it's higher risk of using an ICU bed, and a lot of these centers are using their staff and saving those ICU beds for capacity issues at the medical centers. And the same thing, we have worked with some patients that received CAR T 3 months ago and on a trial, and they are ready to receive their 90-day biopsy and actually have been pushed. And actually they said, let's not do this. It's going to, obviously they're going to have to deal with the data and not having that data at the 90 days for his particular case. But that is happening, and the anxiety that it's incurring for these patients to really want to know at the 90-day if they still have disease or if they don't, now they have to wait even longer.
And I think, Arun, one of the complexities here is that oncology studies are not homogeneous, right? So we have a very complex triage mechanism. We're working with sponsor companies right now to understand, what are the requirements for this particular trial? What are the impacts on infusions? Are they oral or IV meds? How can we use home healthcare nursing? Are these, many of the oncology trials have multiple safety steps built in where patients are simply going for vitals and blood draws and safety labs. Those things we can do at home with home healthcare nursing. And so we're trying to triage these and take into effect what is the risk to that particular patient? What's their immune system look like? What is the benefit ratio? And so it is a very complex model. There's not one answer for any particular indication. So we're working with sponsor companies right now to understand, if we can't replace everything, can we minimize the risk to the patient by doing as much at home as possible, even though they still may need to go to the clinic for one or two things? So it's kind of a balance approach right now.
No, that's great, Kent. Thank you so much. And, these are really complex trials. Dr. Kambolja, can we turn that over to you? Just give an overview of what it looks like to start a trial all the way from, the preclinical side, bring it over to the clinical side and run these trials in the different phases, and the complexities behind how many different groups are involved in order to analyze the data and publish these results.
Sure. So I know like a lot of participants, they are actually cancer patients or caregivers, and those who are not having a lot of scientific background. So I think this is very important for us to understand that why clinical research or drug development is so difficult. So it takes a lot of time for us to find out a molecule or a potential gene which can help in a particular disease. So a lot of work happens in vitro or in laboratories before it can be even tested in animals. So it takes a lot of time up to that moment. And then once it is having some hope, say for example, 10, 15 molecules will give some hope in animal models that it will work. And then 1 or 2 molecules are chosen to move ahead with the human trials. And that's where exactly the importance of the drug development community starts. So a lot of trials, like once they enter into phase 1, they're done in healthy volunteers just to see what kind of safety profile that one is having. And in oncology, especially in cancer patients, it is not done generally. Most of oncology trials, they will start right in the patient population. So at phase 2, generally a dose selection will be done and initial proof of concept will be developed and proven right, whether that molecule is right to move ahead with a particular given dose, because that will be the most important, which different doses will be compared with each other or even with the gold standard of therapy. So phase 2 generally is done in a small group of patients where the actual effect of that molecule is analyzed. And then once the proof of concept is successful, the molecule will move ahead in phase 3. And that is the most critical and I would say most expensive one, because one, it will be a large, it will be done on large pool of data. The design will be very robust, and they will try to include like a diverse population that might be possible, so that it generates good evidence. And these pivotal trials are very important, even from the regulatory perspective, where health authority will be monitoring very closely, like what evidence is coming out of this phase 3. And then once entire data is pulled together, the submission happens and the particular molecule is either given permission for marketing, and then it becomes a drug. Now, talking about COVID-19, lot of, first of all, like let me take one step back. The entire drug development process, it is said that it takes 10 to 15 years. And definitely in epidemic or pandemic situation, we don't have a lot of time. So in COVID-19, a lot of companies are doing repurposing of existing drugs. So they are picking the closest possible molecule, which will be potentially be helpful. And they have started like phase 2, phase 3 trials so that we save a lot of time in doing preclinical research. And that's why these trials are very tricky to conduct in COVID-19. That more than 600 trials are registered on global platform. And out of this 600 trials, I can say my analysis say that many of them are like not very robust enough, and very few of them are meeting the gold standard of RCT. So that is one of the limitations that we are seeing from the early trials, which will be like soon getting completed. So that's something I think everyone should consider. And Arun, you also asked me about how the data analysis is done and who all are involved. So this drug development process involves a lot of different stakeholders. It's not just physicians or pharmacists or so other groups are involved. Like they generally work in background. Lot of data analytics is involved. We need data management groups, biostatisticians, programmers. We also require medical writers and reviewers, those who will be reviewing the data critically as we move ahead. And also important aspect is like regulatory inputs are always required. So it's always a team effort. And right now for COVID-19 trials, I think a lot of companies are coming together to work collaboratively and speed up the things. So that's the entire journey. Very quickly, I tried to summarize.
That was a great summary, Dr. Kambolja. That was wonderful to understand how complex these trials are. It's like multiple carriages in a moving train, and all of those carriages are moving in different directions. And it seems like to try to address the pandemic, one of the things you were mentioning is instead of trying to bring a new drug all the way from the animal models, because that's a slow process, let's just bypass with something that's already been approved, like the anti-malarial drugs, etc., and go straight into the later phases. And that's one of the approaches used. But then we have trials that have been impacted, halted, and delayed that are affecting patients currently that are either continuing their treatment or trying to continue, or that are trying to get on new trials. Kent, PRA seems to be a kind of leader in trying to do remote trials. Can you give an understanding for the rest of us of what it means to be a decentralized trial, what it means to develop and implement some of these newer technologies like remote patient monitoring, et cetera, which will help patients and continue these trials even amidst COVID-19?
Sure. I mean, I think that, Craig mentioned an important point, which is this is not new. So a lot of the things we're talking about today, we have had in place for quite some time. At the very basic level for a patient, it's not unlike telehealth, just a little bit more widespread. And so in addition to telehealth, so where a patient might call their doctor and do a video chat over the phone, we also have the ability today to deploy to that patient's home diagnostic equipment so that those physicians can monitor the patient's diagnostic information remotely, whether that's things like blood pressure or weight or temperature. In this case, things like pulse oximetry. We have the ability to provide to a patient at home all of those types of machines that collect that data, but we can connect those machines remotely via Bluetooth to their mobile device and then push that information to everybody that needs to see it. So in the case of a clinical trial, many of those things would have been done at the physician's office or the hospital at the clinic usually. And so we're just shifting some of those things to take place at home. It's critically important that people understand we're still collecting the same data and ensuring that the patient's safety is still paramount. So those data points that are collected, those blood pressure readings, pulse oximetry, temperature, they are being fed to the same physician that would have overseen you in the clinical trial so that he can help make or she can make clinical decisions based on that information. And so what we're trying to do is where those things would have taken place in a clinic and a patient would have had to gone to a clinic to do that at home. Most of those technologies have existed for many, many years. Those devices that we use to collect that data are FDA approved devices or European CE mark devices. So they are approved and regulated by health authorities. So the data we are collecting is just as robust as we would collect in the clinic. And so what we're trying to do is kind of create an in-home hospital environment for many of these patients. In some cases where there are more technical requirements, we will send nurses to the patient's home to help them with some of those things, whether it's a blood draw or whether it's using some of the equipment. Sometimes with spirometry and things like that, it can be a little more complicated. But what we're trying to do is really create a telehealth environment so where patients can, most of that can be taken and done at home.
No, that's great. I'm really encouraged to see those efforts, Kent, and especially PRA kind of trailblazing here. I fully understand that these aren't necessarily new ideas. It seems like the industry as clinical research and then healthcare has been slow to adopt some of these innovations. And so I really hope that we continue in this line. Now, can I turn it over to you, Alicia, to talk, because we were talking about data. How can we make that data patient-centric? How are you engaging patients? And then there have been some questions that the audience have asked about limitations with health privacy policy and data. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So at Metadata, my role, I'm as the Senior Director of Patient Engagement. I work primarily with patients to help impact the way that we're building out our software solutions. So the team that I work with is the team that builds any of the tools that a patient might use in a clinical trial setting. So it could be through a web portal. It could be any way that they're collecting data, from entering information on a form or survey to wearing a device that might passively collect data as they're going about their day. You know, we obviously spent a lot of time digging into the rules and regulations around patient privacy, but we're really trying to build solutions that patients not only want to use, but understand how it does impact their overall privacy and security. So we're trying to make sure that we're not putting tools in people's hands that make them feel uneasy or make them have questions about whether or not their information is secure and private. You know, these devices today and the complexity of the clinical trials that we're all dealing with in oncology is we're collecting a massive amount of data. There's tons of data points in clinical trials. There's a lot that goes into collecting that. And I think that you know, we just have to be mindful of this sort of data cloud that we have that we're all creating around us, and that sort of gets carried into wherever we go, whatever interaction that we go through. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about how do you build things that are patient-centered. And to me, the fundamental core of patient-centric technologies is understanding what the patient perspective truly is and what the patient understanding is of that technology tool. So what are we actually doing? How are we engaging with them? And making sure that everybody is dealing on the same plane. In light of where we are with trials today and the fact that some trials are being paused, I think this is a very important time in the life cycle of a clinical trial to make sure that patients understand that while the trial might be paused, everything that's collected up to this point in the trial is still there, will still be accessible when the trial comes back online. So I think it's incumbent upon everybody in the industry to really make sure that the patients know what's going on, communicate with the patients, make sure that they understand that this is a temporary pause, and that, behind the scenes, there's a lot of people working on figuring out the logistics of how these trials can continue.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I want to follow up and turn it over to you, Alyssa, if I can. I know you run the Operations Center, Clinical Trial Support Center at the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. Now, with what Alicia had said, how is your center responding to some of this increased anxiety that patients might be going through? And what can patients do to better communicate? What can the community do and the investigators do to better communicate together to get through this?
Yeah, so we're hearing a lot of anxiety, just like Alicia said, from whether it's standard of care and regular treatments that some of these cancer patients are receiving, to clinical trials and not knowing what's going to happen. I think that the trial sites and the investigators are trying to do their best, but with the rapidly changing COVID-19 environment, sometimes it's very hard because what one week brings, the next week might change. So these patients are really trying to navigate them. We are helping them in terms of the patients that come to us for clinical trials. We're really trying to figure out what trials are open, what trials are closed, what trials are accepting new patients, or maybe even some centers that are accepting new patients, because there are some larger centers that are not accepting new patients. So just in blood cancer in general, since that's the patients that we work with, it is very, very difficult in terms to navigate, and our 9 nurses that work in our team are really trying to help this navigation. And there's about 1,500 blood cancer clinical trials. So in order to keep track of all 1,500, it's very hard. But we're trying to dig away at it and trying to figure out and give these patients valuable options, because there are patients still coming to us because cancer doesn't stop, and they still are looking for clinical trials, and their doctors are still recommending clinical trials as well. It's just a little bit more trickier now trying to figure out where are these trials located, and what can they do, and even with travel restrictions, it's very, very hard, and some of these patients are that just puts a lot of anxiety on top of the anxiety that they already had, knowing that a trial might be their next bet for treatment.
And I will say one thing, Arun, that's even more complicated now is to add anxiety to these patients. To go back into the hospital to have a procedure, they still need a COVID test before they can go back to the hospital. And so how do we manage that piece, which is get them tested, get the results, still get them to the clinic. And if they have to go back to the clinic 24 or 72 hours later, they need another repeated COVID test. And so there's all these logistics, and you add all that anxiety, right? How do you deal with all of that? And so we had patients this week who were, half of their time was just getting tested and retested for COVID to go to the hospital to get their procedures done, right? And so we're trying to figure out, how do we utilize telehealth and mobile platform, and how do we partner with the testing companies to create a process that is home-based and seamless. And as more of the antibody testing comes out and becomes more available, I think that will become easier. But today it is a very complex system for patients to navigate, let alone healthcare providers as well. So it's not just about the trial and getting the patient there, it's all the things around that as well.
No, Kent, absolutely. Thank you for that follow-up. It is very difficult in addition to that, because I can tell you from a site perspective that different sites have different regulations as well. Like from our site, we're just not able to at this time allow for off-site investigational product administration, because that's just the IRB rules. And so, Craig, could you talk about some of that complexity and the need to standardize these kind of innovations across the board, and how important that would be?
Arun, there are well-known guardrails that all clinical trials have to operate in between. These are to ensure the safety and protection of the research participants, and to have the confidence, as Kent mentioned earlier, that we will be able to get high-quality data that we're relying on to understand the efficacy and safety of these new medicines. Within those guardrails, we often self-impose additional constraints. And those additional constraints are not institutionalized across the country or across the globe. They're constraints that different research sponsors and pharmaceutical companies may self-impose, that their other partners in the ecosystem, their service providers, technology providers, each individual investigator site then starts to self-impose, that makes it more and more narrow in terms of the options that are available to us. I think this pandemic is helping to re-expand people's mindset around where the true guardrails are against which we have to operate, and to let down some of the self-imposed guardrails that we've created that are largely just due to our own comfort levels, our own culture, our own risk aversion within our organizations. As Ken was mentioning earlier, the introduction of many of these technologies in the home aren't necessarily new. And there are many sites and institutions across the country that are able to support, for example, infusion in the home. These other constraints are largely ones that we've self-imposed for one reason or the other, but this time in particular is one for us to reevaluate those constraints. I was thinking as some of the others were speaking, this is a guidance document from the FDA, and they're similar from the EMA, that are helping investigators, they're helping physicians, and it should help patients to have confidence where the true boundaries and guardrails are that we have to operate in between, and make sure that we're giving ourselves the freedom to operate within those.
No, thank you so much for clarifying, Craig. And I think the theme I'm getting from all of this conversation is there needs to be a balance. We need to try to speed things up and adopt some of these new technologies and innovation, but there needs to be some basic guardrails in place, and those cannot change too much, even though they can be loosened a little bit. And so it's important, I think, to find that balance. But going along with that innovation, Dr. Kambolja, can you talk a little bit about some of the new data science approaches and artificial intelligence approaches that might be integrated into some of these clinical trial conduct, very briefly? Thank you.
Sure. So as like we see that there are a lot of challenges, not only in COVID scenario, but even in routine, there are a lot of challenges, especially in, say, for example, a lot of orphan drug indications, or in cancer trials, there were challenges where patient population was not enough. And since the recruitment was very slow, the trials were moving ahead very slowly. So there are a lot of innovations coming into picture. Like, say, for example, if I talk about real world like analysis, or how we can use the real world data, there are talks that we can use augmented control arms, and that can help a lot of these challenges to quickly solve. So what is augmented control arm is just like, in addition to the placebo arms, we can also take help of external control arms. So those patients are not actually recruited in the trial, but we can use the data from the real world setting in the form of external arm and augment that. And those patients from the real world will be matching closely with inclusion/exclusion criteria. And I think regulatory agencies are also becoming very open in terms of adopting this kind of newer techniques in terms of process innovation. Now, talking about technology, how AI/ML can help, there are a lot of things being talked. So, for example, all the cancer patients, especially in breast cancer, like we know how AI/ML is helping to identify or diagnose early using the imaging technology supported by AI/ML. Now, in terms of analytics, we have certain tools which use AI and machine learning, also the natural language processing, where we can process and analyze large data sets, or even the publications, which may take generally weeks and weeks to analyze. But using the AI/ML technology, we can do such kind of analysis in very short time frame. And I think that is going to change the entire landscape and the speed that will enable researchers to digest the data very quickly. So that's something, one technology I thought very useful. And also then there are, say, for example, cohort discovery models, where AI is helping to identify the patients or subsets of patients which might be benefited much more compared to the regular patients. So AI is also helping to identify the patients using the technology that will speed up the data and exactly suggest to the companies where this patient group is sitting. And also it is already helping the identification of molecules. So there is a huge potential to combine the human intelligence and AI to speed up and solve these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kambolja. That was a wonderful overview of some of the newer artificial intelligence and data science techniques that can be applied to augment these clinical research processes in clinical trials. Now, the audience, you guys have been amazing. I just reviewed the chat very briefly. People have signed in from South Carolina, Washington State, San Diego, Florida, Boston, New York, Oklahoma. And so it's wonderful that all of you are participating here today. Feel free to ask any final questions as we're just getting into the close of our session. But as we're getting into the close of our session, I just want to read a few comments and get some feedback from this amazing panel. It seems that AstraZeneca is claiming that the trial they're launching is the fastest launch of a clinical trial in the history of their company. Also, GlaxoSmithKline, a major pharmaceutical, partnered with Sanofi, another pharmaceutical, and they're both competitors, and they say that is an unprecedented collaboration because they're both competitors in the same market. Are you guys encouraged by this kind of collaboration and people coming together? And furthermore, are these innovations that we're trying to adopt, including some of these measures for decentralized trials and remote patient monitoring and home health visits, are these just a stopgap measure to respond to this pandemic? Or are we going to continue to innovate and adopt these long-term for these patients to improve access to care and provide the best care in the shortest time possible?
And we're absolutely seeing a number of pharma companies getting new studies to life with record speed for them. You cite a few examples, and we've heard the same from J&J, Lilly, Regeneron, and a number of others that are leading the field here. In many cases, as was mentioned earlier, they're using a medicine that was already known, whether that was already on the market for another indication or it had already been in medicine development. And so some understanding of safety was already known to the scientists and the leaders there. That being said, I think many organizations are also coming to appreciate the level of bureaucracy that they're able to circumnavigate to get these studies to market faster. I think it's going to be an interesting challenge, an interesting question that many leaders in those medicine development organizations and pharma companies and otherwise will have in the months ahead. There's almost this spirit of, I knew you could do it. I knew you could develop these medicines faster. And it's going to become a question for the rest of the portfolio. And this sort of links back to your question of what's going to change on the other side. I think that leaders inside of these development organizations are going to know that the people in their organizations can get these studies going faster. And if they could do it during the pandemic, if they could do it for COVID-19, can they do it for breast cancer? Can they do it for other areas where patients are waiting and the demand is there because they know that it can happen, and it can happen without compromising those guardrails we talked about earlier. Now, I wouldn't want to make an assumption that the world is going to look dramatically different for clinical trials after we get through this pandemic. We're seeing some amazing things that are happening in terms of the shift into the home and in terms of the responsiveness that people have made. But to me, I always want people to keep in mind, this is being based on protocol deviations and SOP waivers. And when we use words like deviations and waivers, it means that we're expecting to bounce back, right? We're sort of veering off of a trodden course temporarily with the expectation that we're going back. And in this case, that going back would be status quo. I think it's going to be incumbent on organizations and leaders to go back over the summertime to the things that they've been aggressively changing in their studies to keep them on the rails, and to start to thoughtfully embed those to become their new normal, to thoughtfully embed and change the SOPs, the processes, the vendors and partners they work with, and how they're developing their medicines to make it stick. But just like in many other things, we're seeing change right now in all of our lives, whether education, whether business meetings, whether how we're receiving healthcare. I think the demand is really going to end up coming from the participants themselves. Most of us have now seen that our providers can practice telemedicine. We've seen that in the workplace, we can survive with meetings online and thrive. And I think research participants have seen that we can adapt and enable more flexible participation, and they're going to expect that from us in the years ahead.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was a wonderful overview. We're running out of time, and we have a closing keynote after this. So with that, I just wanted to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. In this session, you've heard from global trial innovation experts about how we are all coming together to speed up clinical research to make it a better experience for all of you as patients, caregivers, clinicians, and scientists. I want to once again reiterate a point that I brought up, and I'm very encouraged by this collaboration, but it's really important we place everything in perspective at this time. How we respond over the coming months will be the ultimate test of our leadership. History will judge us on whether our actions are effective, not whether our actions were noble. Only results matter. To save the people in the world we love, we must fight this fire with everything we've got. But I want to tell all of you in the cancer community, all of you as cancer survivors, all of you as patients, you're not alone. We're all in this together. Also, you guys have already been through so much. You've already survived cancer. You can get through COVID-19. We can get through it together. Once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the panelists for joining today and providing an excellent summary of clinical trials innovation. With that, we're going to transition over to the amazing final keynote panel. The keynote panel, closing panel, is going to talk about how these collaborations are all going to come together from a perspective of state government, local, national government, impact investment teams, organizations like clinical research organizations, and venture capital groups, and regulatory bodies. So stay tuned for an amazing closing session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And what an amazing day, and what an amazing panel. And I think what the last panel discussed, actually, this is a great transition to the closing keynote panel. The focus is collaborations to disrupt the pandemic. And as we are in this, the pandemic is upon us, we have learned our human potential, the true human nature, which is which is actually coming together and working in collaboration, not a competition. So collaboration is our true nature, and we have seen hospitals built in days. We have seen emergency authorization. Actually, hydrochloroquine was a drug that in January our ACT task force kind of recommended that this is one of the drugs that could be repurposed, and we saw from that to advocacy to being is one of the only two drugs in the history of drugs to be authorized by FDA for emergency use. So this is a tremendous so human beings are coming together, and this potential that is building. And as it was mentioned by Craig in the previous panel, this is not going to this is not the end, and this is just a beginning. And we have an amazing panel today. We have Dr. Robert Hariri, who is chairman and CEO of Cellularity, and Dr. Hariri is a founder and was the chief scientific officer and CEO of Celgene, which is now a subsidiary of BMS. We have Peyton Howell, who is Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer at Parexel. She brings perspective from a major CRO, and we have Patty Rossman. She's president of GlowBioX. Patty also has an immense experience working at pharmaceutical companies such as Abbott and diagnostic companies such as LabCorp, and she also worked at American Red Cross. And we have Jay Chen, whose background is venture capital. Jay Chen is a partner at Hope Venture Labs, so he brings amazing perspective from the investment community. And we have finally Oliver Rockroy, who is VP of State Government Affairs at California Life Sciences Association, and Oliver brings his knowledge and wisdom at the intersection of how government and private organizations are working together, and nonprofits working together to make a difference. So with that, I will ask a panelist to do a brief self-introduction. So basically the question is, what do you do, what your professional interests are, and how this COVID pandemic has affected your personal and professional life. So I can start with Dr. Hariri.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me to join you during this, I think, really timely and important session and panel. I currently serve as the founder and CEO of a company called Cellularity, which is a spin-off of Celgene Corporation, the company you mentioned earlier, which has been focused for the last 2 decades on the development of medicines, cellular medicines, all derived from the postpartum placenta. This technology arose in a company that I founded 2 decades ago, which was looking for a solution to the source problem around identifying high quality, scalable, ethical biologic materials for the emerging field of regenerative medicine. That technology, as you know, has evolved quite a bit, and today we're using cells derived from this same organ for their immunologic potential and activity as an immunotherapy for treating things like cancer, immunologic disease. And the reason it's relevant today is that we're using these same immunotherapy tools to treat viral illnesses like COVID-19. So my background is I'm a surgeon by training. I have an MD and a PhD, and have spent the last 30 years either in academic medicine or in industry.
Thank you, Dr. Hariri. Peyton Howell. Peyton, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Peyton Howell, Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer at Parexel. We're one of the largest global CROs, and nearly half of our trials right now are actually in oncology. So, and for me personally, most of my career has actually been focused on patient access challenges, particularly in oncology and cancer care. So of course today, almost every clinical trial is impacted in some way by COVID. So it's very busy, everything has changed, I think, in our personal lives and in our professional lives to keep these studies going and adapting. And I think the last panel did a great job of teeing up some of those key issues. In addition, we have over 100 COVID-related studies and projects in flight. And I'm really hopeful that our COVID work is ultimately going to help us innovate clinical trials and drug development for oncology in new ways, and delighted to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Patty, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Globio, my company, until about 2 months ago, focused on getting are advising and helping companies get their products FDA approved. Since then, the last 2 months, we have been focused, razor focused on getting emergency use authorizations from the FDA for innovative products. The other thing that I do is I founded Life Science Women's Conference, which helps women that are working in life sciences have an environment where they can thrive, gives them support, collaboration, we do business together. So both of those companies have changed pretty dramatically. Globio has shifted our priority, of course. Life Science Women's Conference and Life Science Women's Network relied on meetups and in-person support for other women. But now we're strictly online, and it's good though. It really has challenged us to reach out to our membership. On a personal level, the COVID pandemic has kept me at home for the last, I guess, 6 weeks or so. My 93-year-old mother lives with me, so I'm trying to protect her and myself, so we don't go anywhere except to the pharmacy drive-through and the bank drive-through. So I think it's affected everyone.
Thank you, Patty. Jay, would you like to go next? Jay, you're muted. Thank you.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
First of all, I like your new outfit. So first of all, I want to really thank the organizer and Prasang for your leadership and putting this amazing group of people working together since January. So I think we, as a whole, we have learned a lot about this virus. We have learned a lot about this disease. But more importantly, I think we have learned a lot about ourselves. So at Hope Venture Labs, our goal is bridging the gaps between impact investment and impact innovations. So we made a very, very strategic adjustment in January, and we put our entire effort and resources into this combat against COVID-19. So there are 3 areas that we are actively involved with today. Number one is supporting of a San Francisco-based biotechnology company in developing a T-cell-based vaccine for COVID. The second one is we have a separate team doing some support work, support a number of state and international agencies in their effort of procuring critical medical supplies. And the last one is something we launched together with AAPM. It's a project called COVID Best. Essentially, it's a project focused on protecting elderly care communities and frontline healthcare workers from getting infected. So we're seeing this, this is not just by ourselves. We're seeing many of our colleagues are also kind of readjusting their priorities in the professional and personal life to really thinking about this is something that we all have to be part of it in this battle.
Thank you, Jay. Oliver, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Prasoon. I want to thank you, AAPM, and also the team at Gryt Health for having us. California Life Sciences, we have the privilege of being a membership-based trade association that represents the entire cross-section of the life sciences in California. That ranges from large biopharmaceutical and medical device companies, Genentechs of the world, Becton Dickinson, Medtronic, to academic and research institutions, and then smaller and medium-sized startups, companies that range from 2-person startups all the way to household names. In terms of our involvement with the COVID crisis to date, primarily it's been how we best serve our membership. We are very fortunate to have about 1,000 members, again, very diverse backgrounds, very diverse needs in our ability to serve them. Primarily, we focus on sort of 4 major areas of service: advocacy at the federal, state, and local level, business solutions, so helping them grow their businesses, marketing and events, which helps connect them as a community, and then at the very basic level and the most fundamental level, incubating and helping with workforce development, STEM education, and other, we call it the lifeblood of the industry, other ways to make sure that we are growing the sector in the state of California. As you all know, California is the birthplace of biotech. We are a global leader in the biotech space. And it's been very important for us to really be able to connect with our members during this pandemic in an era where, again, as a trade association, most of our interactions used to be in person. We advocate to the legislature in person. We typically interact with our members in person by convening them and fostering their ideas. So we've had to change dramatically, but at the same time, I think we've had fairly robust impacts on their ability to continue doing business. As far as how COVID has impacted me personally, my accent betrays me, but most of my family lives in France, including my parents, which is another country very hard hit by this pandemic. And so it's been interesting seeing both sides. I live in Washington, D.C. now, but then talking to family members that are in France or other countries in Europe, that just, you know, it's the evolution of this pandemic has really been something that in our lifetimes we've never seen, and we'll look back on one day and hopefully learn from it. But it's been interesting to see how we all persevere.
Thank you, Oliver. I think I look forward to the days when I will share that, you know, we all survived COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, with that, I think you know, we have amazing organizations here. So one of the first questions that I thought I can ask is, what are some of the, you know, collaborative strategies your organizations have taken to address the disruption of COVID-19 crisis? Dr. Harari, would you like to go first?
So, you know, I think we're very fortunate that in addition to, I think, a heroic effort on the part of various government agencies to assist companies that either had assets in development or technologies that had potential use here in COVID-19, that companies have begun to enter into discussions on how they might bring their particular strengths together in order to accelerate the process of getting one of those candidates through the early discovery to preclinical, ultimately to clinical testing. Now, just to give you an example, at Cellularity, we're very fortunate. We're a small company, what might be considered an early stage, developmental stage company. That although we have roots with big pharma, we're fortunate to have strategic relationships with companies in the pharmaceutical industry like Bristol Myers, like United Therapeutics, Sorrento Therapeutics, and so on. And what we did early on, when we looked at one of the clinical candidates we have, a placental natural killer cell, which has native activity against cancer and virally infected cells, we sought an ongoing dialogue with these partners, and the obvious one that stood out because of their expertise and their particular clinical focus, United Therapeutics, immediately began working with us to develop a co-development strategy which maximized the potential for success in that particular program. United Therapeutics is a company that has an exceptional track record in developing products for pulmonary diseases. They understand that the serious complication, the life-threatening complication, as we have first seen it in COVID-19, are these very serious cardiopulmonary effects. What we thought early on were pneumonias, but in fact might be a more complex type of pulmonary injury. There's really no better company prepared to help one like ours understand how the natural killer cell product we have could be deployed and ultimately developed to treat the disease. More importantly, COVID-19 pulmonary complications are a form of acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a spectrum of pulmonary changes which affect both the movement of oxygen into the bloodstream as well as the physiologic performance of the organ itself. That means that you have to have somewhat of a new approach or new thinking on how you deploy the clinical tools to treat the disease. It's not just the anti-infective activity, but it's also an anti-inflammatory set of activities that are necessary. And very important, we need to set the organ up for recovery. You know, after any disease or injury, you have a process which initiates with injury, is followed by an inflammatory response, And then there's a subacute inflammatory set of events which stimulates a repair process. Certain organs like the lung, if the repair process is dysfunctional, you're left with in essence, a pulmonary cripple, someone who doesn't have the ability to come back to a full recovery. So that's an example of a developmental stage company working with a mid-sized pharmaceutical company to understand the disease, understand the fastest path to get into the clinic and demonstrate safety and efficacy, and then have a strategy to ultimately scale and deploy the product. So that's just one example. I know for a fact that there are many others occurring. You mentioned some of them early on, and we're very excited about the prospects that we're talking to virtually every company in the cellular medicine world in order to better understand which of these tools can be brought into this fight effectively. And also, once you get past the wonderful evidence of activity, you have to have a model that can deploy that in the tens of thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of patients who may need it. So this work has got to take place early in the process. Nothing would be worse than us having positive data and saying it'll take us 2 years to deploy it. That's sort of the situation we're facing right now with vaccine development. It's a long pathway, long process to get to an approval. And then once you're there, you have to be able to scale and deploy to the many patients who need it. So these early discussions are very important in preparing us to meet the challenge of this disease in the near term, but also in the long term.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great point. Peyton, would you like to take a shot at it?
Yeah, that was an inspiring one. I think I'll, in addition to that great example on the clinical side, we're just obviously seeing speed of collaboration across sites and sponsors. I think the last panel did a great job of noting just this accelerated collaboration with all of the existing technologies and partnerships we had in place. But as we really work to support patients across decentralized clinical trials, that was fantastic. So probably the collaboration I'd like to highlight that's different is really joining new coalitions to be part of a bigger solution. We're using our experts in drug development, regulatory consultants, RWE or real world evidence all together to really try and accelerate evidence generation for physicians and ultimately hopefully facilitate access for treatments. And as part of that, we're working with several nonprofits. We're doing things frankly for the common good. We're working obviously with our industry associations. So ACRO, which is the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, to try and work with the FDA so that the guidelines, like the updated guidelines you saw this week, continue to advance. And obviously, we hope those really become some things that are permanently part of innovation for cancer care and cancer clinical trials. And then we're also working really with informal advocates to be part of the solution, like apandemic.org, other nonprofits. So really lending our voice in ways that you normally wouldn't see organizations kind of put forth their individual leadership. And that's probably the call to action I have after seeing today's amazing set of panels, is we have a lot of great thought leaders that we need to connect in new ways in addition to our day jobs.
Thank you, Peyton. Patty, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Everyone has spoken today about different collaborations and different great new ideas that the pandemic has forced upon us in a good way. We all know about the large vaccine companies like Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline collaborating to develop a vaccine. The National Institutes of Health is pulling together many in the industry to collaborate to provide the best new medicines to combat the disease. Folks and companies that wouldn't normally work together are collaborating. WHO is a hub for many countries around the world to establish a new kind of protocol that will allow simultaneously clinical trials on many different therapeutic drugs at the same time. And even the FDA is collaborating, and they have actually blown me away. They're collaborating very, very effectively with innovators to guide them through the process to get tests, therapeutics, personal protective equipment, medical devices, and software using artificial intelligence authorized to use with patients. This emergency use authorization, which is commonly called EUA, is not a new process, but it is a process that can only be used when an emergency has been declared. So now the FDA is working closely with innovators because an emergency has been declared, working in ways that I've never seen before. The turnaround now for the FDA getting back to questions from innovators is anywhere from a few hours to a day or two. And this is just really unprecedented. The guidelines are very clear. They're changing daily, sometimes hourly, but they are very clear, pretty easy to follow. And we're getting feedback, like I said, just almost hourly from the FDA. I would like to say in a very hopeful note that not only will many of these therapies work for the COVID outbreak, but many of these innovations that the FDA is now collaborating on are not COVID specific. They will carry over to other areas of medicine and hopefully serve as a blueprint for the future. Some examples are new designs and innovative fittings for ventilators that will have a long use after COVID-19 is gone. I'm also very excited and encouraged, especially by the FDA's interest in bringing new technological innovations to medicine using artificial intelligence and machine learning. There are some really exciting new diagnostic tools that use this technology that will hopefully free up physicians and free up radiologists and really help us as we learn and as the software learns about the disease and some of its ramifications.
Amazing. Thank you, Patty. Yeah, I think that's a long-lasting impact, for good. That's what I think we're all hoping for. Jay, would you like to, highlight the partnerships in the venture capital world?
Sure, absolutely. So for all the projects that we are working on, we have either reached out or contacted by many partners and working on this or working on them together. All of these projects that we're working on, for example, are really operated in I would say, a very transparent and collaborative way, and you'll involve multiple partners, and oftentimes across multiple time zones, across different countries to work on. I guess this thing about working from home really allows you to have more time to reflect and connecting with people that you haven't forgotten for years. So now just using this example, we have partners now working from Europe, from Asia, North America. We also have some contact with the World Health Organization, for example. Right. So I think small or larger organizations are all playing their roles in terms of putting resources together. So one of the very important benchmark for us is to measure the scale of the impact that we can deliver. So I think one of the previous speaker also mentioned that, right? So how do we deliver the results in a scale? I think in that regard, it really requires very large scale of organization, in large scale of collaboration in the public and the private sectors. But I have to say that, in the process, in the past few months, we have observed some competitions. Some of them are not really the type of competition we want to see, particularly, when in the pandemic like this is happening at a global level. This can be a competition for funding or a competition for various reasons. So I think this is really a wake-up time for everyone, particularly the larger players, to thinking about how everyone can work together. this crisis doesn't really obey any national or cultural or business or industry barriers. It is really a target against humankind. So we have to act like we are in this all together in protecting human race. So any unhealthy combination that we are involved into ourselves personally, we're observing, will only further extend this pandemic, and at the end, it will hurt everyone. So I think this is something we all have to come together.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Oliver, would you like to, share your?
Gladly. Thank you. Yeah, I think all the other speakers touched on a lot of great collaboration within the industry. One I'd like to particularly point out, we know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sort of launched this consortium of 15 life sciences companies, and they're predominantly larger biopharmaceutical companies that are normally competitors. And it's encouraging them to get together and share things like proprietary libraries for molecular compounds, and other tools at their disposals that they normally wouldn't be sharing with each other. We've seen collaboration. The GSK and Sanofi example was brought up, but Vir Biotechnology, which is a small company in South San Francisco, partnering with Sanguine Bio. You've got Takeda Pharmaceuticals partnering with Global Blood Therapeutics. It's really bringing folks that sometimes are not even in the same space to come together for the common good. But in particular, one example that we're very proud of, we have 3 of our members, Merck, Eli Lilly, and Pfizer, that came together and went to their employees and said, listen, if you are interested in volunteering, those of you that are licensed clinical professionals or healthcare providers, those of you that are interested in helping on the front lines, we'll give you as much PTO as you want. It's that kind of collaboration, I think, that is really exemplifying what the life sciences and the innovative, creative thinking of the life sciences brings to the table.
Thank you, Oliver. So now, and Dr. Hari, what are some of some of the innovations ongoing at Cellularity to diagnose and treat cancer and COVID-19? Would you like, whatever you can share, actually?
Well, I think we're very fortunate because this pandemic is occurring at a time in the history of the development of new therapeutics where we can take lessons from breakthroughs in cancer. For example, immunotherapy of cancer, the development of CAR T technology, and other types of engineered cellular approaches to identifying, targeting, and destroying cancer cells. Those lessons can actually help inform us on new strategies for treating viral illnesses. In fact, many scientists and clinicians recognize that there are very fundamental similarities between these 2 threats to health. And we at Cellularity had noticed quite some time ago that a unique property of the immune system of the placenta was to serve as a defense mechanism against the transfer of maternal malignancy, and the protection of the fetus and the newborn from pathogenic threats like viruses, certain microbial and fungal agents, and so on. And what we did was we explored that biology and found a way to deploy it in the treatment of viral infected cells like coronavirus infected cells. Now, one thing that we know that not everybody who gets infected with this virus becomes ill. And not everyone who becomes ill becomes seriously ill that they require ventilatory support, ICU care, and so on. What is the underlying difference between those patients? And I think at this point, and it's still early, we haven't done, for example, genomic analyses to look for common denominators that are predictive of bad outcome versus good outcome, although that's ongoing. But we do know that there are some observations made in the original SARS outbreak that are also being seen in this coronavirus outbreak as well. And the common denominator of poor response, as measured in patients from that original SARS outbreak, was an underlying abnormality or dysfunction in the immune system. And those abnormalities appear to have occurred in the natural killer cell population and the what we call the adaptive T cell population that's necessary to clear the body of a viral pathogen like coronavirus. Now, that observation was made after the SARS outbreak almost 2 decades ago. Fast forward, even in this particular pandemic, scientists are reporting the same fundamental thing. Now, if you think about this, we're getting better and better at being able to discriminate between abnormalities in the endogenous immune system of patients. These are studies that can be done very early when you're evaluating a patient. They can also be done prior to patients being exposed to virus in order to identify those at risk and those who are not at risk. But more importantly, it gives us a very directional opportunity to apply therapeutics that can do something meaningful in this disease. That was the basis and the rationale for taking a natural killer cell that we know is been safe and appears to have benefits in treating cancer into this pandemic. And simply enough, the way you can think about it is that viral infection is kind of a numbers game. Infections cause the pathological and pathophysiological effects by taking over the machinery, the cellular machinery, in order to make copies of themselves. And you have a dramatic increase in the viral burden in patients who don't mount a good immune response. If that's a numbers game, then one thing that is a potentially obvious solution is to improve the numbers game by delivering reinforcements in the form of new cells. And that's the strategy that we've taken in Cellularity, and we're working with our partner United Therapeutics to bring into the fight a supplemental, an augmentative immune system in the form of these natural killer cells to do two things. You've heard the flattening the curve strategy epidemiologically. We want to flatten the immunologic curve. And the way you do that is by providing enough virotoxic natural killer cells to prevent a spike in the viral load, which will lead to the serious complications of the illness and allow the patient's own adaptive immune response, those cytotoxic T lymphocytes, to grow and in response and eradicate the viral illness. So that strategy is one that one might argue we're borrowing from the oncology world. And by taking advantage of what we learned in oncology, we now have a very good tool, and we're in the clinic now treating patients, and we're very optimistic this particular approach, or a version of this approach, immunotherapy, is going to be a critical part of the treatment of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Hurry. I think I totally agree, especially the the cytokine storms and the inflammations at the later stage. Peyton, Parexel is one of the largest CROs, and you bring the perspective from the CRO world. Would you like to share learnings at Parexel in response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, there have been a lot of learnings already, as you might imagine. We're also one of the largest CROs in China. So we're really beginning to tease out the beginning of our learnings and best practices and adapting clinical trials in China, and also now beginning to jumpstart studies as well that might have been impacted. And when I think about cancer care, it's critical that we keep studies going. And I think when you see the headlines about things pausing, I think it's our duty to really help fight those headlines and say, no, we actually have to fight through whatever the obstacle or barrier is to really be able to innovate. I do think oncology can teach us a lot in the fight with COVID, both in terms of treatment guidelines, the immunotherapy, as an area. So those are key. And then the other two big buckets of learnings, one was highlighted on two of the earlier panels, is really accelerating innovation. So everything about decentralized clinical trials, really treating the whole patient is critical. And I think those are learnings that we need to take into cancer care, from telehealth, direct patient delivery, getting home health with that when it makes sense, monitoring tools, diagnostics at home. Those are all huge that we have to really push to bring forward. I think the other area that we're just starting to see is really more patient-centric and adaptive clinical trial design for the future cancer research. So specifically, synthetic control arms are going to be critical. That reduces the number of patients that actually need to be in those control arms and be at risk. When you think about the risk benefit, And then lastly, really looking at drug formulation really differently to reduce patient time in cancer clinics. So things that are infused today and maybe a combination of products that are infused sequentially are being done now and developed potentially subcutaneously for a 5-minute sub-Q injection, or maybe even future for self-administered injections. And we haven't thought about that way before. Frankly, reimbursement has sometimes been a hindrance to some of that. We have to fight through those things because now we know we need to keep cancer patients safe. This is going to be with us for a while. So those are some of the big learnings.
Yeah, I think payers have to also catch up because, you know, that's a bottleneck actually. Yeah. So I think that, so yeah, I already got a warning for the 5-minute warning, but, you know, I think it's so in conclusion, the crisis has taught us the real nature of our humankind, which is collaborative, you know. However, our society thrives on competition. So when we go back to normal, quote unquote normal, how we can foster our collaborative nature, and any concluding thoughts or call for action, you know, starting from maybe Patty, would you like to go?
Sure. Well, I think one thing from the FDA standpoint is there are lots of red tape that maybe is not as beneficial as we've thought in the past. And I think to continue their collaboration with industry, especially with innovators, I think is crucial.
Jay, would you like to, you know, share your thoughts? Jay, you're mute, actually, on mute. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, I'll just use the vaccine as an example, right? So, so during the early stage of this company's development, it requires a lot of outside partners, you know, from the vaccine design and the animal study, clinical study. So one of the partners in Europe actually learned. So our team was actually still fundraising at the point. So they decided to say, hey, we know you guys are really short on capital. So we decided to offer you our service on a pro bono base. So basically they did some very expensive work for our team free, right? So that's, you know, something I call a pay forward model in this time. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, our team decided to put some of the very inner core of the vaccine design and some of the framework in the public domain framework, and making sure that not only this team has access to it, but everyone else in the public can have access to it. Of course, you know, the team has signed this, you know, WHO declaration for collaboration among all the therapeutic and vaccine companies. But my personal hope is that we want to see something more binding and with some real incentive to really driving this is really happening, not only for a very short period of time, but really for a much, much longer period of time. So I personally feel like this is a great opportunity to thinking about more of a open source model in life science, particularly around this life science area with a public health implication, right? So I'm a business person in this conversation, but I've been having this constant debate with, you know, the scientists, the public policy people, the investment folks, to thinking about, can we actually all sit down together to think about before the next pandemic hitting us, can we have a much more open collaborative framework with very strong financial backing to it, so we can actually solving those, you know, those common global public health crisis without having to thinking about what is technology we have to protect ourselves, you know, who is getting what piece of the money. So those are the things should not be the barrier for us to solve, you know, this type of problem.
Thank you. Peyton, would you like to share your concluding thought?
No, I'm going to relinquish time. I just think this is a great panel and just very inspired, you know, by all the sessions today.
Thank you. Dr. Hariri, any concluding thoughts?
So again, you know, I think from every crisis and from every global challenge, we come away having learned important lessons that I think can help reshape the future. I actually believe that we may emerge from this with an entirely new way to reshape the way we treat infectious diseases. You know, the era of antibiotics may be behind us after this. But the bottom line is, I agree with the other panelists, This is an opportunity to rethink how the regulatory community works with those of us in the trenches developing new therapeutics in order to facilitate and engage rather than create mountains and mountains of a bureaucratic process, which doesn't really help anyone. You know, the FDA was created, the first mandate was to foster innovation. The second mandate was to protect public safety. I think sometimes what we're seeing today is the head of the FDA is getting back to basics and helping to foster innovation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harry. And, you know, as all things come to end and this panel, an amazing panel has come to end. And what I would like to share is what a debate that was going on last week. So some scientists came together and they did data analytics, and they said that COVID is a major, you know, has taken cancer, heart disease, and has become a major killer in US. And then WHO came and you know, and other organizations and CNN shared a story. No, COVID is not a killer. Cancer, you know, so that means the cancer is still a #1 killer in heart diseases. So, you know, so I kind of felt sad and kind of, you know, or smiled also. And I was thinking that, you know, either it's a cancer kills a patient or a COVID, it's a life lost. You know, it's a life loss of life for the family, loss of life for, so a brother lost, a sister lost, you know, uncle lost, a grandfather lost. So, you know, it's a, so why don't we come together, even though the pandemic passes, let's stay in the pandemic mode and, you know, make progress, because, you know, there are burning needs and there are patients waiting for, you know, so waiting for the medicines, diagnostics. So let's all be in the pandemic mode. Thank you all. This has been a historic event. Thank you for coming together and making a really, you know, a great event. And till we meet next time, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Sitting here listening to this final panel on innovation and all of these experts and conversations that we had today, starting all the way from prevention through testing, treatment, patient care, advocacy, and of course, innovation and collaboration, just strikes me with the best of humanity in some of the worst of times. And to hear not only everybody's expertise in all of these conversations, but the realness and the genuineness with which we're all showing up and all leaning in is just such an honor to be a part of. There's two thoughts I'd like to share by listening to everything that we've talked about today. One strikes me as an oncology researcher. The other one strikes me as a cancer survivor and a caregiver. And so the first I'll share is a quote that I heard early in my career that's shaped so much of the work that I've done, is that our ability to change a situation is directly proportionate to our understanding of it. And when I think about all of these factors that go into the crisis that we're facing, all of these different expertise and these human perspectives, this really is the best of trying to understand this virus, this enemy that's in front of us, and how we all get through it together. And so as an oncology researcher, thank you to everybody from that perspective. And I'll close with my personal perspective. Going through cancer twice in my 20s and then losing my dad to cancer as I was recovering was pain I never expected to face in my life. And my dad's motto growing up our entire life is the difficult we do immediately, the impossible just takes us a little longer. And I don't know that I've sat in many moments where I feel how impossible things are in front of us, both as professionals and as patients. And more so also feel the possibility of what we can do to make impossible what our future will be. And so from both my survivor heart and my researcher brain, I'm deeply grateful for everyone on the panels For everyone who joined us live today with all of your questions and comments. These videos will be recorded and available starting next week. And so for all of the other lives that we touch as a result of this, my deepest gratitude. I'll just close by saying, so many of these people are individuals I've modeled my career after. And so to see all of you together in one place and then to meet so many new people, to me, that is the best of collaboration. So I hope you all feel that way and honored to see what we all do together from this point. Thank you and have a great day.